ユダヤ系アメリカ人から見たアメリカの政治社会大統領選挙を始めさせていただきたいと思います。私は本日のモデレーターを務めさせていただきます久保文明と申します。こちらの法学部の教授をしております。本日の講演会は国際交流基金日米センター米国ユダヤ人協会アメリカン・ジューシュコミュニティアメリカ政治研究会、東京大学ビジネスロー比較法政研究センター、それから東京大学久保文明研究室の共催で実施させていただきます。すでにお手元にご案内があると思いますので、長い紹介は省略させていただきたいと思いますが、アメリカン・ジューシュコミュニティというのは1906年に創設された非常に影響力のあるユダヤ人、ユダヤ系アメリカ人の皆様方の団体であります。で、デイビッド・ハリス理事長は長くユダヤ系の人々のための活動に従事されてきておりまして、で1990年よりアメリカン・ジューシュコミュニティの理事長を務められてきました。それでは、最初に、本日の主催者を代表して、西川陽一法学部長より、一言ご挨拶させていただければと思います。
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this conference, and especially Mr. Harris and the delegation of the AJC. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the University of Tokyo, and also the Japan Foundation. We appreciate very much that the Japan Foundation has enabled this very important lecture. Well, originally I wanted to be here only as an ordinary audience, but Mr. Kubo has forced me to say something, and I think as a host of this institution, I am obliged to say something. And anyway, I would like to wish you a very informative and enjoyable lecture. Thank you very much.
それではデイビッド・ハリスさんお願いします。
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to begin by apologizing for the fact that my speech is not in Japanese. If it were, it would undoubtedly be the shortest speech in history. But I'm grateful, first of all, to the Japan Foundation, to you, Ms. Suka, and to Mr. Chano for hosting us this week, both in Kyoto and here in Tokyo. And I'm grateful to the University of Tokyo, to its dean and to Professor Kubo for their gracious welcome here this afternoon at this extremely prestigious university. And if I may, I add a word of congratulations on the Nobel Prize received by a faculty member here this year at the University of Tokyo. It's certainly quite a distinction. And I also can't help but cite my friend Ambassador Hideo Sato from the Gaimusho, from the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whom I met when we were both a bit younger, about 30 years ago, and who has represented Japan as its ambassador to Afghanistan, to Bahrain, and importantly for us, to Israel. And a friend I have not seen in many years, Ambassador Koji Tsuruoka, who I believe has been leading the Japanese negotiations on the all-important TPP, which perhaps will come up in the course of our discussion this evening. Since this discussion is on the record and not off the record, I can't do what I had very much wanted to do this evening, which was reveal to you who the next president of the United States will be. But it's going to be a newspaper headline tomorrow. So I'm going to have to skip that. But I wanted to talk a little bit with you about the topic this evening, but first bridge it by explaining the connection between AJC, the organization I work for, and that you heard a little bit about from Mr. Chano, and Japan. We were founded, as you heard, in 1906. And we were founded initially for one simple reason, that Jews, particularly in Eastern Europe, were targets of repeated attacks, sponsored by, encouraged by Tsarist Russia. They had no recourse, no source of protection, and a group of Jews in the United States, mostly of German origin, resolved to form a committee in order to experiment, if you will, in Jewish political organization. And the goal was really quite ambitious: to enlist the help of the United States government to defend Jews who otherwise had no defense under Tsarist regimes. Within a few years of the founding of AJC, in fact by 1911, as Martin Luther King reminded us in 1965 when he spoke at a major event of ours, by 1911 AJC was defending the rights of all minorities. In fact, said Martin Luther King, and I quote him, "When few dared to speak, AJC spoke out on behalf of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans who were even more socially marginalized than Jews at the time." To fast forward and reflecting that sense of all minorities depend on one another, in 1942, as I'm sure this audience knows, President Franklin Roosevelt, who to many was an iconic political figure, issued his now infamous executive order, which removed tens of thousands of Japanese Americans from the West Coast and interned them in camps in the middle of America. It was not until 1988 that President Ronald Reagan, in his last full year in office, signed a piece of legislation which offered an apology and redress to the Japanese American community for what had happened 46 years earlier. And I'm proud to say that AJC was the one non-Japanese American organization that had fought for years with our Japanese American friends, organized principally in the Japanese American Citizens League and similar groups, in order to achieve that result. Because we understood from our founding, and to this day, 109 years later, that Jews cannot separate our destiny from others. And that ultimately the best protector of our rights are the rights enshrined in democratic rule, in the rule of law, in democratic pluralism. And in a way, that backdrop helps explain the topic this evening. Because what it suggests is that Jews have a profound stake in the well-being and destiny of the United States of America. In all of our journeys around the world over thousands of years, in what became known as the Wandering Jews, the one country that has protected the Jews unlike any other, perhaps not with a perfect record, but nonetheless with the best record imaginable, has been the United States. The one country that has invited Jews to become full shareholders, stakeholders in the destiny of America has been the United States. And the one country in which we do not speak about the paroxysms of pogroms, of attacks, deadly attacks against Jews, even with anti-Semitism present in the history of America, has been the United States. So for many Jews, America reflects an exceptionalism in Jewish history that began before the rebirth of the State of Israel in 1948. So, to speak personally for just a moment, my mother was born in Moscow in the Stalinist era. She was a refugee to Paris in 1929, like many from Russia. By 1940, she was a refugee from Nazi-occupied France. And she was one of the relatively few Jews during the war that received a visa to the United States. It was not one of the most glorious chapters in American history, but nonetheless, for my mother and her parents, they were able to see the Statue of Liberty from a ship bringing them from Portugal, and they did not see it as tourists. For them, they saw it as the invitation to a new life. Thus, from day one, they, and for me, from the day of my birth, were instilled with the notion that we have a profound stake in the well-being of America. My father was born in Budapest, Hungary, was a refugee to Berlin, and then from Berlin to Vienna, and then from Vienna, spent time in the French Foreign Legion in Algeria, 3 years in a Vichy labor camp, escaped, served 2 years in the OSS, the American Wartime Espionage Service, and was brought to the United States in the middle of 1945. And for him too, the Statue of Liberty was not a tourist site. It meant the end of life in Europe and the beginning of a safe new life in the United States. So for my father and his family, for my mother and her family, this was instilled in me, and I dare say in many American Jews. And so when people ask about the perceived hyperactivity of American Jews in American politics, my answer is really quite simple. If you believe that you are in an exceptional country which defies the pattern of Jewish history over millennia, then you certainly have to protect that country. And participation in American elections is one way of doing precisely that. And so when we look at Jews and elections, there are certain striking things. I don't know whether it was by design. Some of the conspiratorial theories suggest it probably was. But Jews happened to settle in those states which in the peculiar American process are the states that tend to decide elections. New York, California, Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and so forth. So immediately, the importance of the Jewish vote was magnified. I assume this very knowledgeable audience understands the rather complex American system of the Electoral College, which gives to states inordinate power in the presidential elections. If not, I'd be happy to discuss it further in the question and answer period. So number one, Jews were in states that had disproportionate, if you will, influence on the outcome of elections. Number two, mothers and fathers like mine, and there were many, taught me from day one, whether it rains, whether it snows, whether you're tired, whether you're ill, unless you're in a coma, you vote. It's as simple as that. You vote. Not all Americans share that commitment to voting. And unlike countries like Australia, which have obligatory voting, and you're penalized if you don't vote, in the United States, there's no penalty. So Jews vote, rain or shine. And as you know, the American participation rate even in presidential elections, much less off years, is not something to brag about. So suddenly the Jewish community, which depending on how you count us, and that itself is a separate discussion, because there is no formal national census by religion. In some democratic countries there is, in the United States it's prohibited. So instead we have our own estimates, and even those estimates are contested by the Jewish community, because we're an argumentative people. We're not a consensual people. Our blood starts flowing when we dispute one another, and our blood stops flowing when we agree with one another. But roughly speaking, the estimates are between 6 and 7 million American Jews today. That would mean approximately 2% of the American population today. It would have been higher in the decades of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but proportionately, the Jewish percentage of the population is not growing as fast as the American population, so our aggregate percentage is slipping. Nonetheless, you'll see if you examine voting data in presidential elections in states like New York and Florida and the others I mentioned, that Jews may be much more substantially represented than their actual percentage of the population, because Jews vote. Jews have a third characteristic. They tend to vote Democratic. This is one of the most interesting sociological phenomena, I think, for many. Ajc, my organization, for decades sponsored a very prominent intellectual magazine called Comparative. And a number of years ago, there was an article in Commentary by a distinguished Jewish intellectual, Milton Himmelfarb, the title of which was, "Why Do Jews Live Like Episcopalians?" Episcopalians were the WASPs of America, the wealthiest, best educated in America at the time, and vote like Puerto Ricans, meaning vote like Latinos. The suggestion being that we defy the natural sort of social behavioral patterns. So Jews, and I'll start with Franklin Roosevelt and not go back further, 1932, his first election, have voted overwhelmingly Democratic every 4 years, except in one election. Only in one election did a Democratic presidential candidate fail to get a majority of the Jewish vote. And since this is university, I invite anyone to give me their best answer. Which election and who was the Democratic candidate? I won't keep you in suspense. The year was 1980. The Democratic candidate was Jimmy Carter, running for his second term. His Republican challenger was Ronald Reagan. And there was a third-party candidate that year, one of those occasional years where a third-party candidate runs, named John Anderson. And that year, Jimmy Carter received roughly 44 to 45% of the Jewish vote, the only Democrat since Franklin Roosevelt not to get a majority of the Jewish vote. Ronald Reagan received 40%, and this third-party candidate received 15% of the Jewish vote. On the other hand, Jews have voted as high as 88 to 90% for Democrats. Take a more recent election, 1992. The Democratic candidate, Bill Clinton, the Republican incumbent, George H.W. Bush, and the numbers that year, as I recall, were 88% for Clinton and 12% for George Bush. So if I'm a political strategist of either party, and I'm trying to understand this segment of the larger voting population, and what is the elasticity in the Jewish vote, then it's roughly speaking as high as 88 to 90%, as low as 44 to 45%, which is a range of roughly 45%. If I'm a Republican, I know I can go as low as 12% and as high as 40%. And yes, we're speaking about 2% of the population, maybe 3.5 to 4% of those actually voting on election day. But as we all saw in the year 2000, every vote counts. Many Americans didn't believe it for years. And then we all saw it in this dramatic fashion with our own eyes as they had those famous pictures holding up the ballot to the light to look at a word that none of us had known before called Chad. And I don't know how the interpreters will translate that word. So every vote counts. And roughly speaking, as I understand American politics, and I'm simplifying for purposes of making the point, roughly 40% of the American people are going to vote Democratic come what may, almost irrespective of who the candidate is. By instinct, by impulse, by ideology, they are going to vote Democratic. And roughly 40% of the American people, by instinct, impulse, ideology, are going to vote Republican. The real presidential elections, and not only presidential, are actually fought in the 20%. That's where the battle takes place. And when we speak not about 100%, but rather 20%, then it becomes much more obvious that even a small shift in this and that community in the right state can make a significant difference. Now, I want to be completely candid with you, even on the record. We are nonpartisans at AJC. Even my 92-year-old mother, bless her, continues to ask me who I vote for in the presidential elections, and I don't tell her. I'm not sure my secret is safe with her. You don't have to tell her that if you meet her in New York. But that's because by law and by temperament, organizations like ours are forbidden from either endorsing or opposing any candidate for office. By the way, if a candidate for office declares and runs on a platform of open anti-Semitism, we can talk about anti-Semitism, but we cannot call on people to oppose the candidate, or we may well lose our not-for-profit status, which would be completely damaging to our interests. But as a political activist, here's my goal. My goal is to make both political parties fight for the Jewish vote. Yes, people may, by impulse, instinct, or ideology, vote this way or that way normally. But the last thing that we want, is for one political party to take the Jewish vote for granted. And by contrast, for the other political party to write off a priori, in advance, the Jewish vote. And I think what I'm telling you is arguably the political strategy of every definable community in the United States. And if it's not, it should be. Otherwise, we run the risk of, we don't have to fight for their vote. They're going to vote for us anyway. So why expend any time, effort, or energy in seeking their vote? We want both parties believing in that elasticity, believing that our votes are obtainable, and therefore asking themselves, what do we need to do in order to get the vote? Now here we come to a very interesting set of issues. In the case of the Jewish community, before we look elsewhere, what is it that we want? Well, the mythology and it's quite widespread, is that American Jews are a single-issue community. Wrong. In fact, it would get an F in a classroom. Not even close. Jews in America are a multi-issue community, and all of the polling data show it. Ajc does an annual survey on American Jews, and those of you in this hall who wish to see actual numbers and do so longitudinally, that is, compare year to year to year over a span of time, can go to ajc.org and retrieve all of the survey data over many years and look at the data about American Jews. What do we think? How do we view candidates? What are the issues that are most important to us? What are our views on current issues, be it the Iran deal, US-Israel relations, prospects for peace with the Palestinians? How do we view our religious identity? A whole host of issues are there. And each of these surveys and all of the anecdotal data underscore the point that Jews are anything but a single-issue community. In fact, for some American Jews, Israel barely counts. There, I wish it were otherwise, but that's a fact. And we can talk about why, if that's of interest to the audience. But American Jews are interested in economic policy, in environmental policy, in social policy, in national security policy, in a whole host of issues. And our advice to candidates, and though we can't endorse, we can be available for consultation, and we meet with most of the candidates. Our advice is, don't make a mistake and patronize the Jewish community by going to a Jewish event or a synagogue and thinking that if you speak supportively of Israel and Israel alone, you're going to get the vote. No doubt you may make some friends. Perhaps you'll pick up a few votes. But you may lose more votes than you gain, not because of your support for Israel, but rather because you've misread the audience. They're Americans. They pay taxes. They have hopes, they have fears, they have worries. If you don't address them, you're missing them, and they may go elsewhere. So, multi-issue, not to be taken for granted. But what is then the role of Israel for American Jews? From our experience, essentially it is that most American Jews, again, we can't speak about all American Jews because any of you who are Jewish or who know Jews know, and we take great pride in this, that wherever there are two Jews, there are three opinions. So to speak at any moment in time about all is impossible. But most Jews want a kind of minimal satisfaction that the candidate understands the importance of the US-Israel relationship. The importance, by the way, not just to Israel, and not just to Jews, but to the United States. And if they're satisfied, then they keep going and examining the range of issues. If they're not satisfied, then we have problems. And we saw those problems again in 1980 and again in 1992. Jimmy Carter, even though he achieved the Israel-Egypt peace treaty, a remarkable achievement for which the Nobel Prize was accorded, nonetheless was still not trusted by many Jews when it came to Israel. He was not trusted on some other foreign policy issues as well. But George Bush in 1992 was also not trusted enough on Israel. And so votes swung in other directions. But otherwise, it's about much more than Israel. And that brings me, if I may, to another point which we encounter a lot. And that is this term which in other countries often has a derogatory or derisive tone to it, and that's the Jewish lobby, the term as it's used. People try from afar, especially those who don't like Israel, don't like the direction of US foreign policy, and they conveniently ascribe it almost conspiratorially to a Jewish lobby. How else to explain why the most powerful nation on earth has forged this special relationship with this tiny democracy in the Middle East, barely the size of the state of New Jersey, when surrounded by many other more populous, energy-rich countries that presumably should satisfy the foreign policy needs of the United States. So it must be something conspiratorial. And of course, parenthetically, that taps into deeply rooted Jewish historical experiences surrounding notions of conspiracy. The protocols of the Elders of Zion written by Tsarist secret police, the notion that Jews poison wells, that Jews kill Christian children for Passover to use the blood in the baking of matzah. So there's a fertile ground when speaking about these kinds of conspiracies that somehow there is this small group of American Jews who sit in a back room and who somehow decide American foreign policy. This secret I can reveal. The secret is that America is a pro-Israel country not because of the Jewish lobby. America is a pro-Israel country because the majority of American Jews identify with Israel for a whole host of reasons. Religious reasons, democracy reasons, reliable ally reasons, whatever the reasons, they identify. Were it not for that, to me, obvious fact, there is no way in the world that 2% of the American population, which itself can be divided, could otherwise determine the foreign policy of the strongest power on earth. We have a voice, we use our voice, to be sure. But the notion that we can somehow manipulate, and that was the subject of a rather well-known book by two professors, Professors Walt and Mearsheimer, with strong academic pedigrees, called the Israel Lobby, that more or less implied this kind of secret small cabal of evangelical Christians they threw into the mix and neoconservative Jews who somehow manipulated politicians into doing their bidding. And that's the big mistake. Every survey, in good times and in bad in the Middle East, and unfortunately there are more bad times than good times in the Middle East, shows that the American people, by margins of 4, 5, sometimes 6 to 1, identify with Israel. That's the fact. And American Jewish voters, by and large, would like to see that continue. So as to this election, and unable to tell you who the next presidential winner will be, a few additional thoughts. We're seeing some very interesting phenomena that I don't think anyone predicted. We're seeing, on the one hand, a Republican Party in which some 52% of Republicans polled are supporting for the last 3 months consistently 3 candidates, none of whom has ever been elected to any political office in the United States. It's really quite remarkable. And those, including myself, who thought this would really be a passing phenomenon, a kind of what we call in English flavor of the month, are discovering that it's a more sustained phenomenon than it was. Will it sustain itself through the coming months and the first primaries next year and into the Republican convention? We'll see. I have my own thoughts, but it's an on-the-record meeting and I want to be careful to protect our not-for-profit status. And we're seeing another very interesting phenomenon. In the Democratic Party, everyone assumed that Hillary Clinton would be the presumptive candidate with no serious challenge by anyone. And not only do we have a serious challenge by the only Democratic senator in the United States Senate who defines himself as a socialist. And for those of you who know America well, the word itself, normally speaking, would exclude you from most conversations. Not only is he included, but he is giving Hillary a run for her money in some of the early primary states like Iowa and New Hampshire. So much so that he is making Koji Tsuruoka's job in trying to advance the TPP a bit more difficult, Koji. Because, as you know, I'm sure many of you are following the TPP as we are, and we at Ajc support it and have made clear our position and will continue to do so. We believe it's both in the economic and security interests of the United States and our partners for the TPP to go forward. But you've seen that Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State, helped negotiate the TPP, called it the gold standard of free trade agreements, is now finding, perhaps, as she says, because of politics. She acknowledged it on television the other day, that because of the strong leftward pull of the Democratic Party, which no one expected, that she is tacking in that direction in order to try and ensure that Bernie Sanders, by the way, a Jew, but of course who's not running as a Jew, happens to be Jewish. Interestingly, by the way, it's not even an issue. A few years ago, it would have been a very big issue. Not even an issue that Bernie Sanders is Jewish. So who expected that? So what we're feeling in America today, and I don't think it's unique to America, is this kind of establishment fatigue. And we're seeing it in a number of other countries as well. It's not unique here in the United States. This establishment fatigue, those who are part of the establishment are part of the problem, they're not part of the solution. Hence, we move to the left in the Democratic Party, to those who not just say it, but mean it when they challenge the status quo, and those on the right who are not part of the Republicans in Congress who have contributed to paralysis, but those on the outside who say, give me the chance and I'll shake things up. Now, the big question, of course, is at the end of the day, will these movements sustain themselves, or will the life be drawn out of them to be replaced by something resembling more of the status quo ante? Again, I have my own views. We will see. And then to add to the mix and raise further questions for all of us, Joe Biden continues to consider, as people are pressing him, well, are you in? Are you out? We need to know. Hillary needs to know. The party needs to know. Bernie Sanders needs to know. And we expect an answer from Joe Biden anytime soon. So lots of strange things are happening. And how many people who watch American politics, even a year ago, would have said, this will be a Bush-Clinton election. And the big issue then was America becoming a bit like a pedigree nation, where you had to have the family pedigree, the Bush name or the Clinton name, in order to be able to run. And all of a sudden, it's not at all clear that Jeb Bush will be the nominee. Far from clear. And Hillary Clinton has a fight in her hands. If I'm the Republican candidate, what do I learn from 2012? Well, one thing I learned is if I'm going to nominate a presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate, they better be able to win their own states. Because if they can't even win their own states, how are they going to win the national election? Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate, was essentially from 3.5 states. He lived in Massachusetts. He spent a lot of time in neighboring New Hampshire. His father was governor of Michigan, where he was raised, and his Mormon faith is rooted in the state of Utah. Well, he could not deliver Massachusetts, he could not deliver New Hampshire, and he could not deliver Michigan. Paul Ryan, whose name is now coming up again, was the vice presidential candidate from Wisconsin. He couldn't deliver Wisconsin. So how is the Republican ticket going to win if it can't even win its own home states? Second lesson. America has changed demographically. That may seem like a cliche, but clearly someone in Republican headquarters in 2012 didn't get the telegram. They missed the message. And the Republican Party has to change with America. In 1946, in the off-year election, if I recall correctly, 87% of the American population was white. Within a matter of just a few years, America will become what's called a majority-minority nation, where minorities will comprise the majority of the United States. And by the way, parenthetically, since we're here in Japan, a new study has just come out which defies conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom had it that we're becoming an increasingly Latino country. But we have learned that within a few years, Asian migrants to the United States will exceed Latino migrants to the United States, and the largest foreign-born population in the United States will be from Asia, not from Latin America. By the way, this has significant consequences, I believe, for Japan, which we'd be happy to talk about in the discussion period. So what does the Republican Party do if it's basically been appealing primarily to white voters, and the country is shifting, and the Democratic Party is benefiting from the changing demography, which includes liberal white voters, majority of women, much of the gay and lesbian community, the vast majority of African American voters, a substantial majority of Latino voters. How does the Republican Party put together a majority coalition? Big issue. And by the way, the third issue, if I were Republican, just to add to the analysis, is by the time Mitt Romney was nominated in 2012 by the Republican Convention, the Democrats had already defined him. And once the Democrats defined Mitt Romney, I don't think he was successfully able to define himself. And part of the reason for that was, allow me to be blunt, the crazy primary system in which there were more than 20 debates. And in the primaries, as I think many of you know, the Republicans moved to the right and the Democrats moved to the left. By the time the Republicans finished that process, Mitt Romney could not redefine himself closer to the center, the 20% over which people are going to fight and ultimately win or lose. And if I'm the Democratic candidate in 2016, I should not underestimate the amount of discontent with the status quo. And much as you may want to blame it on Republicans, and that's natural, the fact of the matter is that Democrats have been in the White House. So even as Democrats will blame Republicans in Congress, there are many voters who may say, you know what? If I'm unhappy with the status quo, it begins in the White House. And if the incumbent was a Democrat, I'm not voting Democratic. So the issue is how much tumult, how much mobility is there going to be in this roughly 20% who are unhappy? How will they channel their unhappiness? Where is it going to end up? And the last thing I want to say before we open it to the discussion is, in my view, in 2016, unlike 2012, we're going to have a slightly different debate between the parties. And this affects Japan. It's axiomatic. It's traditionally well known that foreign policy does not play a major role in American politics. At the end of the day, as the legendary Tip O'Neill, one-time Speaker of the House, said, all politics is local. Well, I believe in 2016, all politics will not be local. All politics will be local and global at the same time. And increasingly, it's because you cannot separate in life the local from the global, or the global from the local. Terrorism. Terrorism is a transnational phenomenon. Trade, jobs, all of these things are transnational phenomena. You can't localize it to a city or a state or a region. And as we learned, for example, from the near collapse of Greece, which years ago most Americans would have yawned about, what happens in Greece matters in America. And what happens in Greece matters in Tokyo. So this growing interdependence of fate and well-being and prosperity and security is increasingly becoming known to American voters. And the Republican Party, I believe, is going to make a major issue out of national security and foreign policy. And a country like Japan, at least from my perspective, and I've been a friend of Japan for 25 years now or more, I believe, needs a strong, internationally engaged America with both capability and will. You need to know that our treaty matters. Because much of your decision-making depends on that confidence, I believe. Please tell me if I'm wrong. And in this part of the world where you have emerging challenges that will not go away anytime soon, and you know what they are even better than I, you need a sustained attention of America. But in today's world, attention deficit disorder is more often the diagnosis than sustained attention. Anywhere. So, if I were living in Japan, and I wish I were, on many days, I would want to know that whoever is the ultimate candidate for, in either party, and ultimately who will be the president, is a person, he or she, who understands the international commitments and obligations of the United States, is confident in using power, not irresponsibly, not lightly, but nonetheless will not hesitate. And I want to be sure of that. Because in recent years, there have been questions about America's commitment and will. You know that, and we know that. So things that have been taken for granted in the past may not necessarily be taken for granted in the future. And I think among the American people who've been victims of terrorism, but also who have seen the consequences of entering into Iraq and Afghanistan, there's a kind of schizophrenic feeling. We've got to protect ourselves, but let's not go too far. In, but out. We want it both ways. So finding the right American leader is going to be a difficult challenge, but whoever's chosen will have important consequences, not just for America, not just for the Jews, not just for the U.S.-Israel relationship, but I dare say for all of the world, including East Asia. With that, I thank you very much, and I shall look forward to the discussion.
それでは後半ということで、クエスチョン&アンサーの方に入りたいと思います。私の方で少しなんかこう導入的な質問を一つ二つ、させていただければと思っております。一つはデビッド・ハリス理事長がおっしゃったそのアメリカという地が ユダヤ人にとって非常にエクセプショナルな場所であるというふうにおっしゃった、その点と関係しているんですが、ここ10年20年のアメリカの宗教界での新しい現象かと思うんですが、エヴァンジェリカル系の、キリスト教徒の間で、例えばアメリカンズ・フォー・イスラエルとか、アメリカンズ・ユナイテッド・フォー・イスラエルであるとか、アメリカン・アライアンス・オブ・ジューズ・アンド・クリスチャンであるとか、あるいはクリスチャンズ・フォー・イスラエルであるとか、その非常にこう、イスラエルを重視するキリスト教のグループが増えている、台頭している、と思います。で、これは歴史的に考えるとユダヤ教徒とキリスト教徒は長い反目の、歴史があるわけで、今アメリカで、ここ2、30年、あるいは20年ぐらいで起きているその一部のキリスト教徒が非常にイスラエルを重視するようになったこの変化というのは、そういう長い、キリスト教徒とユダヤ教徒の歴史からすると非常にかなり歴史的な画期的なことが起きているというふうに評価していいのか、いやそれほどでもないと、まだまだキリスト教徒とユダヤ教徒の関係はそんなに変わってないというふうにお考えなのか、その辺いかがでしょうか。
Thank you very much, Dr. Kubo. And by the way, before trying to answer the question, may I also introduce Mr. Jerry Rosenberg, who, could you raise your hand, who since January has become our representative of Ajc living in Japan. So for anyone who would wish to continue the conversation locally, I hope that you'll meet Jerry and do so. Thank you for the easy question. It's a big question, but let me begin by saying the Jewish-Christian relationship has undergone, I would argue, a revolution in recent years, first of all in the United States, but in much of the world, because as we meet here at the University of Tokyo, this month, literally this month, marks exactly 50 years since the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church gathered in Rome and adopted what became known as Nostra Aetate. And Nostra Aetate was a revolutionary document that, from the perspective of the Catholic Church, absolved, I put that in quotation marks, absolved the Jewish people of the charge of deicide, which had for centuries been the explanatory force for much of the anti-Semitism that Jews endured in Christian lands. The last 50 years have been a veritable, I would use the word earthquake, but this is probably the wrong country, and I felt an earthquake a little earlier too. There was thank you for giving me the experience. So I'll find another word other than earthquake, but it's been a dramatic turnaround in the nature of the relationship between Christians and Jews, and specifically Catholics and Jews. And the United States has been in the vanguard of implementing not just the word of the doctrine, but the spirit of Nostra Aetate over these last 50 years. So on a broader, if you will, interreligious and social landscape, Christian-Jewish relations today, I think, are extremely positive in the United States, and I dare say in many other countries as well. By the way, so much so that on the one hand, people pay no attention to the fact that Bernie Sanders is Jewish, as I mentioned, and on the other hand, suddenly in America, the intermarriage rate between Christians and Jews has gone through the roof. Now, for Jews, that's good news and bad news. I mean, it's good news because it means acceptance. It's bad news because it raises questions about the future of the Jewish people. We're small, And if there's much intermarriage and no future identification with the Jewish part of the relationship, we decline. But the sign is that the Kennedy family and all of the families that years ago would never have thought of bringing a Jew into their family, now all have Jews, and vice versa. But more specifically on the evangelicals, this is an interesting development. I think, Professor, that the numbers of evangelicals have more or less leveled. And it's not at all clear that the younger evangelicals are necessarily following the political patterns of their parents. They seem to be much more interested, for example, in liberal issues like environment and immigration than perhaps their parents were. And on the issue of Israel, again, allow me to speak candidly. For many Jews, they welcome the support. For other Jews, it creates an unease. And that's because many Jews believe that the basis of the evangelical support for Israel is not shared democracy, shared alliance, but rather rooted in Christian eschatology. I don't know is there such a word in Japanese? Okay. Eschatology means, in a way, the end of days. Thank you. Sort of an end of days view of how the world will unfold, in which Jews play an enabling role to achieve the Christian eschatological vision. And many Jews also worry that the goal of the evangelicals is to convert the Jews. To which, by the way, my own answer is, I don't worry, because if I'm not ready to convert, no one's going to convert me. So why spend time worrying? Then the issue becomes, if you allow me a lighter moment, and I know humor is a difficult path in an intercultural setting, so forgive me, but I'll try. The question that divides evangelicals and Jews, or maybe even Christians and Jews, is the notion of the Messiah. So Jews believe that Messiah has not yet come. Christians believe the Messiah has come and will come a second time. So my view is that we fully accept Christian support for Israel if it's based on even eschatology. And if we reach the point where the Messiah does come, then we will ask a third party, maybe a Buddhist, to approach the Messiah and ask the Messiah, is this your first visit or your second visit to earth? If it's the first visit, we will expect an apology. If it's the second visit, we promise to offer an apology. And until that moment comes, we'll accept the support.
本日デイビッド・ハリスさんをお迎えしてユダヤ系アメリカ人の方々がどういう活動をしていらっしゃるのか、どういうふうに世界を見ているのか、どういうふうにイスラエルあるいは中東を見ているのか、そして中づくアメリカという国、アメリカ合衆国という場をどのように評価しているのか、さまざまな示唆を得ることができたというふうに思っております。最後にデイビッド・ハリスさんに大きな拍手をお願いして、これを